Welcome, everyone, through all time and space to an all-new episode of Weebs on the Weekends, a podcast where we break down the anime news highlights of the week and give a retrospective look at anime that premiered 10 years ago. Today's episode is a part of our season of special guest hosts. We'll be giving our thoughts on all 26 episodes of the 2011 anime Thundercats. My name is Jay Johnson. I'm a part-time Weeb and full-time English language sensei. And with me, as always, is my co-host Sam Martinez, part-time Weeb and full-time automail mechanic. Now, Sam, you are the star of our podcast, but as always with our guest hosts, they become the stars, so I'm so sorry they have to eclipse you, if that's all right with you.
It's okay. Was it time makes the heart grow fonder? Soon the audience will remember why they love me.
Yes, we all love you, Sam. But for today's guest, he is a long-term U.S. civil servant. He's previously a teacher with the JET program. He's also my senpai from Peace Corps Mongolia. Our guest for today is Ariel Wyckoff. Welcome to the podcast, Ariel.
Good morning, guys. Happy to be here.
All right, so I did give some bona fides for you, Ariel, but, we don't really care about that. We don't care about your standing in the international community or how important you are in the United States or Japan or Mongolia, around the world. We really care about your taste in anime. So, as with always, our guests have given us a list of 9 anime that define their tastes, animated projects, anime programs that define their tastes. So, can you share your list with us?
So, I picked 9 that represent kind of my tastes. And you have to imagine first, and one of the reasons I wanted to be on here is because I was a kid growing up in the 80s. Your senpai, that's putting it politely. I'm getting up there in age. So I've had on my list Voltron, the original, Battle of the Planets, if you know what that is, which came before Voltron, Transformers, the original, and a few that kind of came up later on that I really liked. Batman Beyond, because I loved the way that it was done. I've always thought of Batman as a type of ninja, and I don't think that comes out anywhere as clearly as in Batman Beyond. And he was also one of my favorite characters, and just so you know, I'm more of a fan of the DC universe than of the Marvel universe, and there's reasons for that. So on that also, I added Young Justice. I could also probably add Justice League as an anime series. I had I've already said Transformers. Afro Samurai, if you have not seen, watch it. Then Samurai Jack, because Afro Samurai made me think of Samurai Jack, which was just awesome. Pokemon, and what else did I have on her? Oh, Mononoke Hime, Princess Mononoke. As representative of that whole Miyazaki universe. I loved all the Miyazaki films, but Princess Mononoke was my favorite. And part of that is because if you look at that, I don't know how much you wanted me to go into here, but part of that is because you have a strong female character in a Japanese film. She's a native, and she's also represents kind of that film more than others represents the unity kind of humanity and nature and the dangers of environmental pollution. You wanted to talk about not really my sort of international career, but I've always focused kind of on the environment a little bit. And also because with Princess Mononoke, that's sort of the period of history when the Yamato in Japan were moving north, right? A lot of that is a story of the Ainu and the Ezo, which was another name for the Ainu, sort of resisting the imperial advance of Japan as it moved north. And you talked about the JET program. When I was in JET, I was in the Northeast. I was in a town called Mizusawa in Iwate province. And if you've been up to Iwate, it looks like that area in Princess Mononoke. And they remember their roots up there. There's all this stuff about Aterui, who happened to be an Ainu warrior, and this and that. Anyway, that's kind of a little bit of a discursive conversation there. My honorable mentions to this list also were Teen Titans, G.I. Joe, and One Piece, which also is called Luffy Pirates sometimes.
Yeah, no, thanks about the little bit about Mononoke, because that was my first film to Miyazaki, so it has a good place in my heart, and I didn't realize that it had historical significance as well as the environmental themes that it was trying to push. So that was thank you for that. Would you mind talking about Battle of the Planets just a little bit, because I'm not familiar with that?
So Battle of the Planets was a show. It's similar to the idea of Voltron, or the original Voltron. When I'm thinking of Voltron, so there was 2 versions that I saw. There was the one with the lions, and there was the one with all the cars. And the one with the lions, there's 5 lions. And you had the leader, one guy who was kind of overweight, one guy who was kind of a kid, and you had a woman, and then there was like the second in command dude. And Battle of the Planets, it's almost the exact same cast, but they're like birds. I mean, they're not birds, but they wear these bird suits.
Oh, I remember that show now. Yeah, like you said, like they have like the bird suits, like they were all in the same colors, like red, blue, yellow. I think one was green.
Yeah, and one was pink, right? And it was, but it's very similar. There was this one dude who was meant to be the main character, and then his like competitor, kind of second in command. Which, by the way, if you think about, we're talking about Thundercats, Lion-O and Tigra, and kind of that dynamic. It was sort of there with Battle of the Planets, and it was also sort of there with Voltron with the original, right?
Okay,
So there's
yeah.
the two guys. The one dude who's definitely in charge, and the one guy who's like, I wish I was in charge, but I'm not. And then you had like the woman who was strong, but also kind of the feminine character that you needed, which is sort of like a Chitara character. And then you had the one big guy, but rather than the Panther strength thing, it was more like he was sort of like this reliable but kind of overweight dude. And then you had sort of the kid, which in if you talk about that same metaphor going all the way to what do you call it, to the Thundercats, it's split between Kit and Kat, but it's like one character in both Voltron and Battle of the Planets. And they flew around in this ship and did all this stuff. But I remember that when I was like very young, before Voltron or any of those came out.
Yeah, so if you wanted to talk about how Battle of the Planets like kind of resurfaced recently, wow, it's not even recently, I guess it was 5 years ago now, but Key and Peele on Comedy Central did a skit.
Yes.
Where,
did they really?
I remember that skit.
Yes.
Oh man, how did I miss that?
Yeah, it's really decent, but the joke is that they keep calling the African American Ranger the Black Ranger, even though he's in the Green Falcon. So.
That's okay. So that's going back to God, that show that I never watched that everybody loved. The Power Rangers, right? The Black Power Ranger.
Yeah, so it plays up both the Sentai elements of Power Rangers and the Battle of the Planet. So that's kind of where, I guess if you want to say, like, to connect the generations, that Key and Peele kind of pay homage to a lot of older properties through their comedy for that reason, because they're big nerds.
They are.
Yeah, so, okay, that's a really good snapshot of you. It's a lot of spacefaring, a lot of superhero stories. Princess Mononoke is a very good metric for how old a person is. Well, actually, Studio Ghibli is a good metric for how old a person is, because like Princess Mononoke, for specifically I guess 90 kids, it was very much their first entree into like very gory animation, and like even nightmare fuel with I actually don't know what the creature's called in that, the one that takes over the Eldritch Spirit. But yeah, it's like horrific elements in that basically dates you for when you were like, oh yeah, of course I can watch this because I'm old enough, versus probably kids from our generation, me and Sam, like we lean more toward the
Totoro, My Neighbor Totoro. Yeah.
I find out that a lot of people in our generation, Jay, they end up preferring Spirited Away.
Well, that makes sense, yeah, because that would be in 2001. So kids of the 90s, that would be the exact age as Sen, the main character in that film. So you can kind of connect to the main character in that reason. Well, Princess Mononoke was a teenager, so if you were being raised in the 80s or late 80s, then you would be that age when Princess Mononoke came out. So it's very much a good barometer for Studio Ghibli movies when your favorite Ghibli movie did happen for you. So that is our snapshot of Mr. Ariel Wyckoff, our guest for this episode. But now let's move on into some discussion about our 10-year review of Thundercats, which is very much under the radar. Not many people know that this was actually a Japanese studio-produced project. It was brought up by Warner Brothers Studios for, actually Warner Brothers Animation at the time, for Cartoon Network. And I think it went under the radar because this was post Toonami. Toonami was basically dead during this period. So Thundercats premiered on proper Cartoon Network and wasn't really geared for their expected audience. So there's a lot of things to talk about why this wasn't appreciated at the time, but that's why we're coming back to it after 10 years. So I have a question, because we are seeing it hasn't been a trend, but adaptations kind of stay standard in the industry, given with you can always recycle properties. Different generations come in and they want to experience stories that their parents or their grandparents experience. We see that with I think later this year there's a new G.I. Joe movie.
Oh, the Snake Eyes is coming out live action. I know that's happening soon.
Yeah, either this year or early next year. Transformers has been kind of been stuck with the Michael Bay school of action movies for the past decade. Same thing with Ninja Turtles, had 2 movies. Same thing with Michael Bay, and even with the animated series of Ninja Turtles has been on Nickelodeon for like the past half a decade. So, Ariel, let's start you off with a softball question, but given that there's at least a wave of adaptations of 80s cartoons, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like you're being pandered to? Do you feel like these stories are worth retelling? Do you have like a strong connection to the cartoons that you saw as a child and interested in seeing them happen nowadays?
I mean, to some degree, yes, I'm glad to see it, but I'll be honest with you, part of it is like the same. It's like I know that the people making the stories now were the people who were kids watching them, and I think part of it comes from like their love. Like I like this when I was a kid, and I want to see it done, and I want to see it done better. You know what I mean? I think that's part of it. I mean, if you and to the degree that they kept a lot of the original spirit in some of these, it's good. But then there's also things that kind of like bother me, like with Transformers. I almost feel like the live action films I didn't exactly love. I mean, there were some good things about it. Maybe it was just some of the actors that were in it that just kind of annoyed me. I didn't mind looking at Megan Fox, of course, but I didn't know if she was the right person to be in that role. I got mixed feelings about what is that actor's name? Shia LaBeouf, whatever his
Shia
name
LaBeouf,
is.
yeah.
I think he was okay in the first movie. I think he did a good job, but then it sort of like went to his head, and he became kind of a, can I say douche on the air? So it just sort of seemed like to me. But look, I mean, the thing is, I know I'm being manipulated. It's like, okay, you're a parent now. You've got money in the bank. You can start, you know, not just watching our movies, but buying our stuff. I don't know if we want to talk about it because I don't know if I don't see it as, maybe entirely relevant to the conversation. But a big thing for pushing these, even back in the old days in the '80s, was we want to sell toys. I mean, do you know how many GI Joe toys I had as a kid? It was like my room was filled with them. Transformer toys, Voltron toys, and Voltron toys were expensive. I remember my dad saying, "If you want that Voltron toy that costs $100, you're gonna give me half of your birthday money that your grandma sent you." Like it was like, you know what I mean? Like this stuff was expensive, and I was like on my parents' back, "Buy me this, buy me this, buy me this." And I know part of it, like, and He-Man, Voltron, Transformers, all of those. It's like it was a toy selling like bonanza for these companies. Like Mattel, I'm surprised I didn't see. I was looking for it. I'm surprised I didn't see the Mattel sticker on Transformers when I was. I mean, on Thundercats when I was watching it again. But that's what's happening here too. It's like why not go with something that we know sells? Ninja Turtles is the perfect example of that. And did you know, by the way, Ninja Turtles started out I think as a role playing game because I knew a kid in the '80s who was talking to me about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was like, "What's that?" He's like, "Well, do you play D&D?" I was like, "Yeah, I play D&D." He's like, "Okay, well, there's this other game, a role-playing game called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles." And I said, "Well, it sounds weird." It was like, "Oh yeah, let's roll for your character, whatever." And I remember I ended up being like a mutant rabbit or something. you know,
you're Yojimbo, Yasagi no Jimbo.
yeah, Yojimbo. That's funny because that actually was a Mifune Toshiro film before. Anyway, but then but that was he had this like, oh, let's play this role playing game, and this was before like a year or two before the cartoons came out. Then the cartoons hit, and then it was the toy selling extravaganza, and then it was the movies, and it was like all this stuff. So it's like I like the spirit of bringing back what you love, but I'm also a little bit like cynical enough to know like they just want to make a lot of money off the same old idea. Not to slam Star Wars here, okay? But like, dude, how many times do you have to blow up the Death Star? Like in the new movies too, for real? I mean, it's just kind of that feeling a little bit there too.
Right, because there is this market, as you said, like for toy lines, and we'll talk about that about why Thundercats didn't really track as well for the 2000 version of itself. But yeah, with the 80s cartoons, I actually had a lot of the toy figures. Like I had a Battle Cat and a He-Man. Never saw the show, but I had the toys. And speaking as like a 90s kid with the Power Rangers, I think I had basically every Megazord up through Power Rangers Mighty Morphin to Power Rangers in Space. I think that's like 5 installments of that series. But yeah, most recently, I think what you're talking about, Ariel, is what like drove Kevin Smith, the director, to do the He-Man series. I think the He-Man Revelations. I think that's the subtitle for it. But yeah, that came out this year or premiered this season. But yeah, the idea that these are mythic heroes or these are mythic characters, and how else are you supposed to sell these ideas to kids and keep it going through generations and pass it down the line? That's something that's very tangible. And something I think, Central, you want to talk about is He-Man and She-Ra. Is it Princess of Power is the subtitle?
Yes. I while watching this, like I wanted to go back and watch it because, as we said, like a whole bunch of '80s stuff was going on, and I feel as though that this show in 2011 was this version of the Thundercats was essentially the proof of concept that basically paved the way for what we were able to see. Because not 5 years later, we were able to see Voltron appear on Netflix, and shortly after, we saw She-Ra, and which is weird that She-Ra got its show or its reboot before He-Man was able to get his reboot. And with She-Ra's design, it's at least like that show, the aesthetic is more different than what we see in Thundercats and in Voltron, where it's really heavily influenced by anime animation and as well as the traditional aesthetic. But in Shira, it mainly takes cues from more American animation in the sense of the lines are a bit softer and the characters are a bit more round, like you would see in Adventure Time or some of the more current shows. And it seems as though the themes that they also deal with, it's also themes that say people in the LGBTQ community deal with. Or at least like that's the vibe that I get from what I see on Instagram and stuff like that. Again, I wanted to watch the show to be more informed when talking about this, but I just wanted to at least mention how popular She-Ra has become before the He-Man reboot came out, because I think the She-Ra series, it had maybe 4 seasons, if 3 or 4 seasons, before He-Man was able to get his. And I feel like with He-Man, just very much like what you said, Ariel, like a lot of these people are like people that grew up with the franchise, but you also are a little hesitant because its original intention was to make money, and so like they're trying to make money again. But I think because Kevin Smith is the one that's spearheading the He-Man franchise, I do feel as though that it is in proper hands than what has happened with the current Star Wars films, the last 3 films that just happened. Do you have the same? Do you think the same way, or do you think differently?
You bring up some really good points, made me think for a second there, and I appreciate that. And I think part of that is, and that's something that I mean, and it's good here we're talking across generations. I'm like of that older generation that saw the original stuff, and I'm coming back to it. And then you guys are 10 or more years younger, and you have a little bit of a different perspective. But I think you're right, because He-Man coming out, it's like he's just this big bad dude with a sword, and he will just like kick your ass in a very old school, like Schwarzenegger kind of way.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to go there with He-Man, but honestly, let's remember Conan the Barbarian just came out like a year or two before He-Man, and basically He-Man is like a blonde Conan, honestly, right? And he goes into and he fights Skeletor, who lives in this dark, gloomy old castle, which is very similar to what happened. I mean, not exactly, right? But in Conan the Destroyer, Conan the Barbarian, right? So it's a very male, macho kind of like my boot is in your face kind of thing. Whereas She-Ra on the other side was more like female empowerment. And it's fine. It's kind of good. It's like we're adjusting. We're seeing. It's good that we're making space for in my mind, and it is something about this new generation where it's like let's open up and understand anyone can be a hero. A woman can be a hero. LGBT character can be a hero. I was having a conversation about CW a little while prior to this, to this recording. We were talking about some of the, drawbacks of those shows, but let's recall that's the first that in Supergirl they put on the first trans hero, trans character, trans female who's a hero, and the actor is a trans woman also. We
Oh,
haven't seen that
I didn't
before,
know
right?
that.
Yeah, it's okay because I watched Supergirl, obviously, right? But so it's like you have a new ethic, kind of for a new generation, and I think that's a good thing, right? Even when you're rebooting these old shows, right? So it doesn't surprise me that She-Ra coming back has that ethic. Now, I honestly, when I was growing up, being an 11-year-old boy, I was like, She-Ra, thumbs down. I don't want to see She-Ra. Who cares about her? You know? And it was like, but also, I mean, part of it was because they put her in an outfit that looked just a very sexual and, kind of thing. It was like, this was not Captain Marvel in, Arthurian outfit, right? This was a girl with a sword, mimicking.
With like a tutu, yeah.
Yeah, like mimicking He-Man or whatever. And the characters were a little bit more like two-dimensional, I have to say, for He-Man. I didn't go back and watch the show, but some of those, I mean, they were kind of two-dimensional, I thought.
Yeah, for that reason, like, you can talk about why it's good to have these new, basically adaptations of these source materials. That with the 2011 version of Thundercats, you have a more up-to-date perspective on, I guess, the motifs that they wanted to address. Because when we get into the breakdown of the whole series, and you have, like, even in the first episode, we can talk about strong ideas of racism and what is, I guess, a sense of imperialism, where it comes from Mamra taking over Thundera or destroying it. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, because I do have some more preset questions, because it is 26 episodes that the series is, and there's only so little time to talk about it. But I did want to get your perspective, Ariel, about your time in Japan, and if that has influenced your consumption of media in a certain way, or at least has it colored it. Because as Thundercats is a adaptation series of an American property, that this Japanese studio, which is Studio 4 Degrees Celsius, has basically taken this property and applied the anime, quotations, anime aesthetic to it by putting in, like, telltale choreography that comes with anime fight shows or fight battle animes. Same thing, like, with dialogue scenes as well as compositions of scenes. So I wanted to get your opinion on, how do you feel that, or how do you see, like, certain media from the Japanese perspective? I know you're not Japanese, but given your time in Japan, how do you see that media projects or productions are censored for Japanese people? Because even looking at Disney, who has kind of become the king of modifying their properties for different regions, given that, or they release all their products overseas. I think my favorite example of this was for Zootopia. There was a very small censorship where the news anchors in that world were different animals depending on which country that film was released in. And with Japan, the news anchors were tanukis. In China, they were pandas. In Australia and New Zealand, they were koalas. But for us in the United States, they were mooses. And same thing with Canada. So, like, it's very weird when properties do get censored for a particular reason to kind of match the maybe ideologies or the cultural sensitivities to a people. So do you see that in a particular way with Japanese people?
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, to be honest, but I don't see it as censorship per se necessarily with Japan, because when you say the word censorship, I think about, like, China, like, coming in and saying, okay, you want this here, cut out all of this content and change this and change that, and if you don't, we're just not going to show it out here. That's more what I think of when it comes to censorship, and I don't see that as much with Japan. It could be just I'm, like, overly empathetic to the Japanese perspective a little bit because I've lived there and I've seen how things go. It almost, I mean, it surprises me a little bit though. I mean, the one thing about the difference I've seen between, like, Japanese culture kind of is part of anime. And you notice I didn't have a lot of, like, strictly Japanese anime on my lists, but with some of the things that surprise me are, I mean, not surprising, but kind of catch me a little bit are when the characters sort of imbibe a kind of old school Japanese ethic. Like, it's it wouldn't apply to Thundercats per se, but a lot of times, like if you look at Sailor Moon and things like that, where women have to be overly sexualized or like skinny or you know what I mean, or just or seem like they're always have to depend on men to do things, whatever. I mean, for Thundercats, the one thing I noticed in terms of that was Chitara, right? In the original Thundercats, which I just watched, she's kind of buff. Chitara's kind of this buff character, even for a woman, right? And I mean, you could tell obviously she's a woman, but in the new Thundercats, she's skinnier. She has wider hips. They make her a little bit more like they play up on the sexuality a little bit more, where it's less the case in kind of the original. And that's just my view, and maybe you guys will see that differently. She looks different, right? And part of that is kind of the Japanese thing. There's also, but this is something I saw in sort of, you talked about the sword fighting scenes or whatever. As somebody who had learned, and I'm not going to say I became very proficient, but I did earn rank in kendo. I was a kenshi, and so anytime I see sword fighting in a film, I notice it's like when they're doing the katas, when they're using the swords in a way that I see, Japanese swordsmen or people who do kendo or iaido. Like I noticed that, and I did see that in the new Thundercats, that the sword plays a little more, to my mind, and again, I'm not an expert here, but in my mind, it looked closer to the way Japanese actually handle swords.
So, Ariel, how much of a scrub was Lionel when he was sword fighting?
I mean, in the initial scenes, like he was obviously messing up, like, and I like that though, where he's being taught, right? He's being tooled a little bit by his dad and by Jaga and even by Tigra. It's like but that's kind of good though. But then you always that brings me back to another theme, right? You always kind of see that in like Japanese style films. The little kid needs to take his lumps before he can make it,
Oh yeah.
before he can grow up. Whereas like in the original Thundercats, it's like, I'm a kid. Oh, I get out of the ship. Oh, I'm an adult. Look at that. And I'm super muscular too, even though I had no exercise. you know. But to the question of Japanese censorship, maybe I'm just the wrong guy to ask. I don't notice it as much. I don't see it as much. You're right that the style, that the way they've changed the content a little bit, the drawings are a little bit better. And one thing I noticed is the haircuts. Japanese are like, especially young people, they're very image conscious. And the old Thundercats with their crazy Richard Simmons looking hair, that wasn't going to fly. And it's honestly, look at the original haircuts of the original Thundercats. They're horrible, but they reflect the 80s. Whereas the new ones, like all I know is a stylish cut. You know what I mean? Like, and that's like a thing. Like Japanese, even in the modern age, like anything where you have a hero in a Japanese film, the guy is going to look stylish. Like you're not going to have Charles Bronson or Clint Eastwood or even Stallone looking all beat up and bloodied and like tough, but like we've got like 3 days growth of beard and the bags under their eyes because they've toughed it out. No, your guy's going to look like he just stepped out of the shower and like cleaned himself up real nice, even after a huge battle, right? And that's you see that in this Thundercats too. Like they look, maybe I'm going too far with this, but they look like kind of like a more aesthetic of a hero in Japan.
No, I'm glad that you brought that up because I had mentioned to you guys before, like I watched the first episode of the '80s Thundercats, and that was the first thing that came to my mind when you had mentioned the hair. I was comparing the old Chitara to the new Chitara, and I'm just like, they did old Chitara dirty, just like having her hair all over the place. At least like the new Chitara, like her hair, at least it's in like a ponytail. It's some sort of form. It's not just crazy all out there.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I did say censorship, but I guess I should have meant more like modifications based on cultural sensitivities, which I kind of said, but just wanted to be clear because what was in the forefront of my mind with this property is that how is it going to be animated by a Japanese studio but actually shown to American audiences? Because this was the voice acting first happened with the English voice cast, and then it was later dubbed in the Japanese later. So we've only seen a few instances of this. I'm glad you brought up Afro Samurai because that was one of the other properties that basically was geared for American audiences first, before then it was shown secondary to Japanese audiences. Same thing with Space Dandy a few years later, and it has happened like very infrequently throughout the years. But it's odd that we have talked about in previous episodes about the Marvel animes as well. And it's very interesting to see properties like done by those in the anime industry, but taking sources from, across the world. I mean, Japan has done this in a lot of other cases. Like Hayao Miyazaki is famously known for his love of British children stories. Like we talked about most recently,
Earwig and the Witch.
Earwig and the Witch. Yeah, Howl's Moving Castle is the same thing. It's by the same author, Child's Story. But also, like one of the most long-running animes is actually a Scandinavian story. I think it's called.
Not that Anna and Green Gables thing or whatever, are you? Not talking about that.
No, it's something Yodel. It's like Yodel, no, something. But yeah, I forgot to tie that down in my memory. But yeah, Japan has done a lot of work with like adapting foreign properties. So I wanted to get your perspective on that, because we see that in the anime community, like on the other side, where most recently in the spring anime season, there was this anime called Tokyo Revengers, and part of the uniform of the gang in that show has the Buddhist symbol for peace, the swastika. And if you watch it from the Funimation side in Japan, it's uncensored. But if you watch it from the Funimation side in the US, it's censored. Sorry, Japan, not censored. US side, censored. So it's very odd when you see censorship in that kind of way, that the studios are sensitive to what like American or Western audiences might perceive something to be when it's not what that is in actuality.
I mean, I didn't see that so much with Thundercats, or maybe it's the universe, but part of it is because I think they stayed as faithful as possible to the original in most ways. I mean, you're right about, like, with a lot of Japanese films, they seem to, when you get into representations of other cultures, and that's something that you can talk about, is like, it's always stylized and a little bit kind of stereotypical, and not always in good ways, if you know what I mean, right? But I mean, this is Thundercats. They don't have like the Germans or Europeans or whatever. It's not, I remember watching a Full Metal Alchemist, and I was like, what are they? It was this, I don't know. There was almost like they were like bowing down and worshiping the Dutch or Danish or whatever in this one film. I know they have a bunch of them, and I was like, this is ridiculous. But I've seen that on the other side, where they'll predict people who are non-white or non-Asian in just really terrible like ways. Even in Yasuke, when they just came back, which was, I have mixed feelings about Yasuke, but then they had this like witch doctor from Benin or something, and it was the stupidest. I was just like, ugh. But I mean, this avoids a lot of that, I think, and that's one of the things that I think makes Thundercats really good, is that you don't have a lot of that stuff. You don't have a lot of like the misappropriation of different cultural things, which sadly is part of what you see in Japan. You don't have wooden-looking conversations, which, sorry, Japan, like you have a lot of wooden conversations. It's because you have a kata for everything. Everything has to be done a certain way. There's very formalized speech, and that comes out a lot of times, even in stuff like Doraemon, or like these older like Toei films, like that Japanese cultural like the staticness of certain speeches, of ways of speaking and ways of doing things, is very present in a lot of Japanese anime. Like people will say things, and it's like, this is a thing that is said in Japan. If you don't know that, and it's going to seem like you're having a strange conversation, right? But you don't see that in Thundercats.
Yeah, I was expecting that more to bleed into it. That's why I'm kind of making the point, is that they didn't do that. So like my film knowledge with like Japanese media is like Kurosawa, Ozu, Miyazaki. Oh, well, now you have to say Hayao Miyazaki to distinguish him from his son Goro. But yeah, Hayao Miyazaki. Oh, and there's always that third one I'm always forgetting. But is it Mizuguchi? Like those are like the three big modern Japanese filmmakers. But yeah, whenever you come to speak to like how do directors bring their own cultural identity, their experiences into the media that they're producing, you're expecting that to be reflected, but it's wholly just seems like an American property. And I think that's the beautiful part of it, is that it's not so distinct from what you would see on Cartoon Network to say, oh, this needs to be in a certain block. So to say that like Toonami, when it premiered back in the day, was for like all these anime Asian imports, but with 2011, when this premiered, it was just part of Cartoon Network's lineup. And it's very interesting that it does stand by that kind of philosophy, that it doesn't need to be separated. But I think that's also a reason for its failure. But I want to talk a little bit more about that later on when we get to the ending and how it ended. But before we get there, I would like to give some background information on its premiere and production before we start talking about the episodes in earnest. So, Thundercats, this was the 2011 adaptation that premiered back in July 29, 2011, is an American animated TV series, which is a reboot serving from the original back in 1985 of the same name. It was produced by Warner Brothers Animation, which I mentioned before, but the production cycle, something that we talked about before in previous episodes with globalization and its effect on media creation, is that the pre-production was given to Warner Brothers Animation, but the production was actually given to a Japanese studio, 4 Degrees Celsius, which is responsible for the two films of Berserk. We talked about Berserk when the author passed away very recently. But yeah, they were responsible for those 2 films, as well as the Animatrix, which I think that's probably a little bit more widely known that they're responsible for that. Actually, is Animatrix a known property? Because I'm like such a nerd for the Matrix.
I think there's like at least giving a brief synopsis of the Animatrix might be good, because I think the Matrix itself may be a dated franchise.
Oh yeah, that's fair. I mean, given that the 4th movie is about to come out next year, I think people are probably going to revisit it soon. But the Animatrix is basically a 9-episode anthology series of other happening stories alongside of Neo's story inside the Matrix, kind of in the same vein as how they've been doing recently with Love, Death, and Robots. Different creators were given a property and say, okay, you can do what you will with this property and come up with creative stories. And Studio Madhouse is the one that worked alongside Studio 4 Degrees.
Oh, now that you mention it, I don't know if Ariel knows, but they're doing something similar for Star Wars on Disney Plus, if you have Disney Plus.
Yeah, it's like but it's I've seen it, and actually I talked to my son because my son's a Star Wars fan. Let's watch this film. There's like 5 or 6 like smaller episodes.
Yeah, essentially, they're doing 9 episodes for Star Wars Visions, where Studio Trigger, Studio Production IG, and a bunch of other studios have come together and just say, oh, here's the expanded universe, do what you will. So it's very interesting that, these anthology series are still chugging along. But other than Thundercats, it is in the genre of action, adventure, sci-fi, and it also falls under the subgenre of Sword and Planet, which is in the same family as Sword and Shield and Sword and Sorcery, but a little bit mixture of that space odyssey, space opera kind of attachment to it. Is available on Hulu, rated PG-13, and the story centers on Lion-O, the Prince of Thundera, and a small band of Thunderians following the destruction of their kingdom by the undead sorcerer Mumra and the lizards. Yeah, lizard men, lizards. But yeah, so it's very interesting that this is actually my one representation of Thundercats that I know of. I didn't ever watch the 1985 version. Ariel, when you're speaking about like how it's different, I'm going to be like completely in awe because this is my Thundercats, which is weird to say for a 30-year-old property. But
Yeah.
given we usually talk about the 3-episode test on the podcast, where the job of a effective writing or a writer's room is that you get invested inside the story within those first 3 episodes. Usually 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. You either get attached to the characters, the world, or the theme. So given that the first 2 episodes is like the premiere, and then like the 3rd episode is like, we'll talk about that. But with the first 3 episodes of this 26 episode series, did you feel like your interest was peaked enough? Did it feel like it was paying homage to the original series? Like after 3 episodes, were you committed to doing all 26?
I mean, certainly, definitely I was, and to the point that I was hooked, where my sons were coming around and saying, what are you looking at, Dad? Is this Star Trek? I said, no, for a change. But my little son, who's 5, he just sat down and started watching with me. He says, I want to be the mummy. I said, no, the mummy's the bad guy. You can't be the mummy. But first of all, the faithfulness to the original series, for the most part, grabbed me. But I was also struck at the differences. I mean, it seemed because in the original series, you'll I don't know, okay, I guess you won't, but like the original series, to start off, they're in the ship, they're leaving the planet of Thundera, which is being destroyed, which is like basically getting blown up and for natural reasons. And then they are refugees and they land on Earth and they have to reestablish themselves and they make friends with the Burbles and then they discover Mumra and Sly, the worm, the frog guys after them, etc. Whereas with Thundercats 2011, right away it's like they're in this palace, and I'm like, "What? What's this?" And you meet his dad and his mom, and it's like this whole story where he has a brother who's Tigra, but they're not. They're only. He's an adopted brother. Tigra is, and it's like, whoa. It's like it's different enough. And then their kingdom is destroyed, and then their whole vibe in the new Thundercats is we are trying to reestablish ourselves. We are trying to get back, and I like that. It's a very different vibe than the original Thundercats, and also like the idea that technology is kind of like abandoned by the Thundercats. Like they're not into technology. They don't know what technology is. They don't know what bombs are. They don't know what all these guns are like. What are Mumra and all these and Slyth and all the lizard troops, like what are they doing? How do they have all this technology that the Thundercats didn't until Panther arrives, which is but I mean on the and which in the original series it wasn't like that at all. They like arrived and they knew how to do stuff and they made friends and whatever. So it was a contrast. It was like there's enough of a faithfulness to the original series with the animation, although it's improved in my view. But enough of a difference in the story to kind of catch me like, oh, they're doing something different here. They're like, that they're setting the whole tale up a little bit differently. And when you find out later that there's a lot of mixed feelings there, right? Like the Thundercats have failed us. Like why did they fail us like that? The people of the kingdom of Thunder, like, oh, they failed us. How dare they? Whatever. Like, and there's the resentment that's kind of there, which that whole vibe was absent from the original series, right? Because it didn't happen. Like they were leaving the original planet of Thundera. There's this whole convoy of other ships that were coming with them, and they were all destroyed except for the Thundercats, that one ship. And it's really different. And the whole idea that the Sword of Thundera, the Eye of Thundera, actually comes from Mumra originally, that was just fascinating to me. But it really caught my mind. There's a lot of these different things that were at play that grabbed my attention right away, and I really liked it. But the one thing I noticed, which is also, this is coming from a kid from the 80s, right? The whole idea of overtly trying to give you a moral lesson, which was very present in all those 80s like types films. Like it was in Voltron, it was in G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle, right? And it was in Thundercats, where they're overtly telling you, this is how to be a good person, kids. It's not there. It's not there in this one, but which is fine. Like we didn't really need that smack in the face every time we watched the show. But I was right away pulled in by it.
Did you catch the Moby Dick homage in episode 3? Because like that's when I was kind of sold on the idea of what at least the vision of what the show was going to be. Because if they're going to talk about off the bat that the heroine, or not heroine, but the hero of the story is starting off at a point of revenge, and even at episode 3 that they come to terms with that in that kind of Moby Dick Captain Ahab kind of way, is that he gets over it and says like, I don't need to be out for revenge. I need to do right by my people, because a lot of what Lion-O is presented as, at least in the first 3 episodes before we get into spoilers after that, is that he's a entitled not foe, but he's a technophile, and he's kind of dissatisfied with his standing that his kingdom is in, and that's what his father says. Claudius says that your older brother, he doesn't say like his older brother is more right for the throne, but he was like, why can't you be like your older brother? And like even the Swords of Omens appoints him to be the king, but that doesn't mean he has the right to rule, but he isn't ready to rule. And if you're going to connect it to other starfaring stories, that's the same thing with Luke Skywalker in New Hope, is that yes, you have the capacity to be a Jedi, but you aren't ready. He has to give up control, revenge, whatever his mental block is. And I think that lends to what you were saying, Ariel, about these characters being multidimensional. There doesn't need to be a happy, poignant moral message. at every single step of the way. And I think that's, again, something that maybe Cartoon Network kids weren't really vibing with.
I mean, they want to show you rather than tell you. Whereas, because that's what watching the old show again in prep for this, I noticed the dialogue. I'm like, wow, this is very like over the top dialogue. But if I can tell you two other things that came up right away when I watched the new show, it was like, where's Panthro? You a-holes. How did you not include the coolest Thundercat of all, you SOBs? Where is he? And part of that, but that's what I wanted to continue to watch because they mention him, but he's not there. The other thing that popped up is Snarf. Snarf is completely different in the old show. I mean, Snarf doesn't talk in the new show. He's more like a pet, and he's a cool character, and he's whatever. But if you watch the old show, Snarf is like this little, kind of nagging, like, I'm gonna protect Lionel, and he tries to fight, and as annoying and kind of ineffectual as he kind of is, he's actually kind of brave. Like, he tries to do the, stand up for Lionel whenever, and he gets smacked around. The new Snarf is not, and I at first I was like, I don't know, Snarf doesn't talk, but then I came to like that new Snarf, because honestly, like the old Snarf was kind of annoying.
I'm so glad that you brought it up because, as I said, I tried to dip my toe back in the '80s Thundercats, and no lie, not even 5 minutes in, and going into watching the new Thundercats, I've heard that a lot of people who watch the old ones, everybody always hated Snarf, and everybody liked it, that they made him more like a pet character, and I'm like, I don't really see it. But then I go back and I'm watching the '80s. I'm like, okay, now I understand the hate for Snarf. I mean, there were so many scenes in that first episode where I'm like, this scene would have been so much better if he was just silent, like the pet Snarf that we've seen. It would have been more effective, actually. And I couldn't watch the 3 episodes of the original '80s Thundercats mainly because of Snarf. It was like he always had to put in his 2 cents in. I'm like, why do we have you?
Dude, he was like the Urkel of the show. You know what I mean? Like, kind of like throwing some guy in to be funny and make, these comments, but he's kind of right. But the way he's saying it is so annoying. Like, you know what I mean? Like, do you really need him there?
Yeah, there's always some kind of element that panders to kids directly. Same thing with He-Man. I believe it was like some kind of hooded dude, and he was like floating around.
Oh, yeah. That little like
something, I forget, right? He looks like the black mage or a white mage from Final Fantasy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was, and I forget, that's what he looked like, but I forget the guy's name. Darn.
Yeah, it's okay, because so what it sounds like I'm learning about Thundercats, the '80s versions from you right now, because with everything that goes into the lore building in these first 3 episodes, and we'll get to spoilers very soon, but it's very interesting. Like you mentioned, like the Eye of Thundera isn't something that's native to the Thundercats. That is basically a power that Mamra has been after. And even when he gets around to killing the king, he's like after what's his, essentially. And that's kind of where you start off with the series, is that you were in the way of something. So it's not like villainous intention for no reason. It's not wanted destruction. It's like,
it seems like he was the OG Thanos.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, because I think they describe, when they talk about Mamra, they talk about it in the past tense as like he's like, oh, he's an arch villain of our people. So when he shows up, you're like, that setup of why would I want to follow this story after these 3 episodes? Well, they have a long history, and they're unraveling this mystery of the world itself, the characters, and who is this guy that just showed up and wrecked shop, essentially. And we'll get to like why season 2 didn't happen, but like one of the things that I saw in at least the concept of season 2 was that they're going to talk about Mamra as like the main character, and how did he come to make an agreement between the lizard people to attack Thundera. So very looking forward to talking about that a little bit, but let's get into a little bit spoiler talk. So Ariel, let's talk about your favorite character and favorite moments of the series.
I mean, they're kind of tied up in my mind. I already mentioned, I think that Panthro was my favorite character.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's because he was the badass from the first series. And here they show him as like, he commands respect, and it's like the reason, and it's you never see this in the old series, but he's just kind of like, Lionel, you're a dork, you don't know what you're talking about, I'm gonna do things my way. But my favorite scene, I guess, in this series in 2011 is when Panthro shows up. It's right after they're in that briar patch, right? And it's burning those like the flower people petalos, like I guess they were called. Like they are flying off into their whatever new homeland, and then they're surrounded, right? The Thundercats are surrounded in this burning huge briar patch, and the lizard people are there, and they've got their like Robotech style looking guns, and they're like shooting at them, whatever, with lasers. And Lionel's like, we're gonna like take them on. And he runs out, and it's like a suicide like thing. We're gonna go out swinging. We're not gonna take this lion down. And then Panther shows up. He like comes in. He's got this huge tank, and he levels the lizards and makes them run away. And they're like, well, who are you? And he's like, oh, I'm Panther. That is my favorite. That's my favorite scene. Partly because it's like, yeah, Panthro's back. Partly because he's like, I'm just gonna walk in. I'm gonna have a tech. I'm gonna smack this guy's down for you. And I just like that. I mean, it could be because getting old here, but the older guy who knows what he's talking about. He's strong. He's powerful. And Panthro also, because in the original series he's actually a little bit shorter than Lion-O, but he's still like super strong. And this series they show him like he's like significantly taller and wider, and like he's this big badass guy. And then we were talking about things that make things Japanese. When he got his arms cut off and like they put on the robot arms from the burbles, that's Japanese. Like they would not. That's very Japanese.
Huh.
It's a, you know what I mean? Like bringing that into it. Like not only is Panther this big badass dude who can fix anything and make anything and makes a tank, he's also a cyborg. It's like, okay.
I thought that was a reference to Mortal Kombat, the character of Jax.
Oh,
because Jax has the same kind of cybernetic attachments for his arms, and they even show that in the new version, the live adaptation of that that came out this year.
Yeah, it was this past year.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Sub-Zero. Spoiler alert for that, but his arms his arms gets frozen by Sub-Zero and gets them removed. But yeah, even in the second movie, Annihilation, like he still gets his robot arm. So I saw that as like a homage to Mortal Kombat. So I'm glad that. So do you think like Panthro is like the dad of the group? Is that why you're vibing with him?
It could be, right? He is sort of the dad of the group, to be honest with you. And also he's like, he puts aside that kind of petty fighting between Tigra and Lion, which didn't exist in the first series. In the first series, first of all, Tigra and Chitara were a couple from the start, and they were older. And Tigra was obviously not related at all in any way. There was no royal family stuff. Actually, if I have to talk about one of my second favorite scenes is when Tigra gets lost in the mountains and he discovers all the tiger people that he's part of, and they turn out to be, these demon-possessed things that otherwise would be dead and whatever. But it's part of it. Yeah, I guess that is part of it. He's a father figure. I'm kind of a father. I talked about I like Black Lightning. Why? Because he's a dad. He's a superhero. And he's about my age, and he takes care of his family, and he whips ass. I mean, yeah, I kind of like that. So it's that vibe that I kind of like, but also just because like it was kind of a restoration of faith, right? Like, you know what I mean? And there's that concept that's in this series very overtly, which I think is less the case from the original series, of resurrection, right? Of life after death. And why do people come back? Panthro we thought was dead, but he wasn't, but he came back, right? And he's a force for good. Whereas you have one other instance that I don't want to mention it because it's maybe something we'll talk about later, where that's not the case, where someone comes back for the wrong reasons and there's something else that happens. But then, and you don't have as much like with the vibe of like Jaga, who's in the first series, he's like Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? And even the way that and I know Sammy's going to talk about this too, right? Like in the fact that like when he's in the ship and they're going to Third Earth in the original series, and Jaga does his life force depletes and he just collapses and there's nothing but clothes, in the same way that Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? And then he keeps reappearing in the Jedi spirit form. He's like, Lion-O, do not use force. Again, it's that like lecturing, that moralistic lecturing that's from the first series. Right. Might does not always make right. Defer to others. Use your judgment. Think about things. He's not as present. And Panther doesn't play quite that role, but he does fill out that sort of like guidance role a little bit.
So, yeah, you mentioned my favorite moment and character as well, Ariel, already. But Sam, how about your favorite character or moment?
No, so my favorite characters. It's funny because Ariel mentioned them both. It's Panthro and Jaga, and I don't know. I guess because like with Jaga, he took more of like that mentor role. At least like in the first two episodes that we had with him, you got this rapport with him and Lionel, right? So you have like this sense of reverence from Lionel. So when he does end up passing, and he reappears in the Book of Omens, you sort of have like that fist pump. It's like, yes, like the sort of the moral leader as well as the spiritual guide, is still going to be there with them. Whereas you get a bit of that Obi-Wan feel in the first iteration of the Thundercats, but and you do get a sense of his sacrifice too, as what Ariel had mentioned, but you don't really get that relationship between him and Lionel like you do in this remake. So for me, I got a deeper appreciation between the relationship, and I also did like Panthro. However, my favorite moments were it's kind of odd because I did try to watch the Thundercats once before, but for some reason, just the moments between Lion-O and the Pedal People that stood out to me when I first watched it, and even talking to some of my friends who had mentioned who had seen Thundercats before, that was the first scene that they had mentioned, right? Like for some reason, like that interaction between Lion-O and the pedal person just was just stuck out, even though like that could have been considered filler. Just the fact that Lion-O grew in interacting with somebody who aged twice as much as him, who started out as I forgot what the opposite for senpai is, but like the student underneath him, yeah, the person that he was influencing, and then ends up becoming his mentor, within the span of a day or so. And like that was, I guess, like that's a good example of how you can I guess have reference for somebody's relationship, like just the way that was done. And this is a bit of a question for Ariel. So you mentioned how Panthro was your favorite character. So then, what did you think about the times when Panthro was treated as the butt of the joke? Say when he couldn't swim or when he was afraid of heights. Did that make you feel any sort of way, or you just sort of rolled with the punches?
Kind of. I think the reason they had that in there was because like you want to have a character, you want to have some vulnerabilities like in all characters. You can't have like Superman, you know what I mean, and it be realistic. I mean, sort of you can, but it, I yeah, I didn't feel too bad about that. Like you know, Panthro, he yeah, it's I guess it's like sort of a crack in the armor. Like even someone as hardcore as Panthro needs to have some vulnerabilities, needs to be brought down to earth a little bit, right? He can't be like too over the top superhuman. But yeah, and the thing is like you don't feel bad laughing at him because you know he can take it.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's definitely the type who can take it as he dishes out the jokes. Now, Jay, you had mentioned that your favorite character was Tigra. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Ariel mentioned it before, but the episode is episode 17, Native Son. It's basically breaking down what happened to the Tiger Clan, and it kind of just like blew my mind, that episode. So, of what Ariel shared with us so far is that that's not the original dynamics. That, oh, they're just a fun, merry band of different colored tiger or cat people all living as one, but that's not the case. And they mention it in this episode that basically, well, Tiger's father reveals what actually happens, but essentially that they've been cursed by the ancient spirits, which, again, this is something that Mamra prays to, and it's kind of a weird mythology behind it. Like, you kind of get glimpses through the 26 episodes and talk about season 2 where they fully explore it, as well as like the Eye of Thundera and the other stones that are needed for the Sword of Omens to properly be full powered. Basically, the Infinity Gauntlet, essentially. well, Tiger's my favorite character, so that's that. But the moment where I really just fell in love with his character is when his father has been cursed and he changes into this shadow beast and he's trying to kill him. You get the, I guess, kind of playing off of what Ariel said about resurrection, is that the Tiger people, the Tiger clan, he says exists somewhere between life and death. So it kind of has this like Middle Earth kind of elf elf's vibe to it. But he hands Tigra the whip, his famous whip, and I was like, oh, I had that whip when I was a kid. I never watched the show, but I know that whip,
Yeah.
and that's such a weird way to like dole out everything that was in the original series in like very natural, organic ways. That yes, Tigra, all these people are from different clans. Yes, he was accepted into the royal family, being adopted because he's the Moses baby, essentially.
Yes.
And you know he would be Ramsey, Lionel would be Moses, of
Yeah,
course.
that's such a good way to put it. I didn't think about that. That's perfect.
Okay, good. I'm glad you connected the dots for me, so I'm glad. But yeah, so it's really cool that maybe because I like angst in my media, I like that brotherly dynamic of, oh, I hate you sometimes, I hate you other times, and that they fight. We talked about a anime very recently called Blue Exorcist, and I
Yep.
love that series for the same reason. Is that, but Tiger is the older brother in this instance, and he's jealous of his younger brother because his younger brother is like the carefree type. He doesn't really take his responsibility as the actual crown prince serious. And then he also has this weird love triangle. It's not even a love triangle. It's just they both like Chitara, and she likes Lionel somewhat. So it's very interesting to
Like
see
this
how.
love arrow.
Yeah, love arrow. Yeah, it's not a triangle because that would be like each of them love one another or each other, but the other one doesn't. But yeah, I very much fell in love with this character in episode 12 when they go to the astral plane and the elephants, because there's this line he says. Um, so like that's the episode where Chitara kisses Lionel, and Lionel says something along the lines of, "That's why she's going to choose me." Tigress says, "That's something else you didn't deserve." And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this guy so much because you see where it's going. You see that he's either going to betray Lionel or something. He's going to sacrifice himself to save his younger brother. So even in that small interaction, you can see that if a 26 episode series is paced out properly, you're going to see all of that unravel. And that's kind of where I tuned into the show. So like the 3 episodes, I kind of enjoyed, but when I got to that 12th episode, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of depth to it, because with 26 episodes, you have basically 4 arcs or 2 arcs. You have 12 episodes, 12 episodes, and that extra episode is like the transitional episode. So that's our favorite moments, our favorite characters. We all basically have different ones, but that's good. So I want to move on into, since we're reviewing this after 10 years, we're coming up on its 10-year anniversary. The question always happens with this kind of animated series is that, does the animation hold up? And from what Ariel said, it sounds like you didn't really notice anything janky about it. We say janky when it comes to CGI, but Studio 4 Degrees doesn't really use CGI in a janky manner. But did you find anything like odd about it? Did it seem like something that might have came out in 2021? Like, do you think it aged at all?
I mean, if you're asking me, because I never watched it when it first came out, because it's like, I was all caught up in my career and being a parent and all this stuff, and I didn't notice when it first came out, but I thought it looked good. I didn't think it looked bad at all.
Yeah, I think Young Justice came out 10 years ago, so I guess using that as like a barometer, it feels in the same camp of animation that has held up over all these years. Like nothing's dated about it.
Dude, I'm not gonna lie. When I was watching it, I had to stop myself because like as I was watching Thundercats, I sort of got lulled into like how good the animation was. I was thinking that I was watching Voltron, so I was thinking that the show was going to be bingeable. And then there were these hard cuts for the commercials, and I'm like, ah, damn it, I have to wait now, like for like 30 seconds for it to keep going. And like but like seriously, the animation, the amount of effort and time that they put into this, like the all the CG, so like the the tank, the spaceships, the Mumra ship, the transformations, the fluidity of the animations, it held up very, very well. And I'm just floored and surprised by like how much effort and quality was put into this. I mean, Jay, like like after watching that show, the CGI and graphics are better than some of the anime that we've seen earlier this year, where the CGI is complete crap, and it's just like, what are these people doing wrong that Thundercats did right?
Well, what they did right is that I'm glad you mentioned that because it's just about the studio. Is that Studio 4 Degrees Celsius is like one of those unsung heroes of the anime industry because of they don't really put out much. They don't really like broadcast their. They don't really do high acclaim series. They basically do experimental projects. So this was originally pitched by two creators. I'm forgetting their name, but two Cartoon Network, and they were like, okay, so find a studio, and they went to 4 Degrees Celsius and were like, okay, we want you to tackle this. And 4 Degrees Celsius, I don't have to keep saying their name, but they basically do series that has something that they can experiment with. So at 2010, we always mention about the CGI effect that that's what ages the most. But like you said, like the tank was fully generated on top of the cell animation. So that's something that we've seen just done poor even to this day. But 4 Degrees Celsius does it so well that you really don't know that this is 10 years old. And that's why I wanted to point to like we saw it 10 years ago somewhat, and then Ariel seeing it for the first time now. It's like it hasn't aged. It seems pristine to this day. And 4 Degrees Celsius is kind of like the studio equivalent of, I guess, would be A124, A24 Pictures. Even if you look at their film released 2018, oh, it's a curse word, but let's see if I can say it. It's like Mutafakers. And
Whoa.
I've seen that one on Netflix. That animation is very good, but like you said, it's a little bit more experimental because the lines are not as hard as we've seen in Thundercats, but the fluidity and some of the animation it's very similar.
yeah, exactly. So it's kind of jumping, I guess, if you're looking at printed form medias, that it's kind of like the comparing of Japanese manga to Korean manhwa, is that they're always trying to push some kind of level of technology in animation. And Thundercat does that in a way that sets a standard, but we just see that turned out nowadays, but they did this 10 years ago. And then what they're doing now is kind of revolutionary, but no one's really talking about it. And Motherfuckers is like one of my favorite films of the past decade. So I just wanted to give props to them because they're doing the Lord's work in the anime community.
Wow, that's high praise.
Yeah. So to follow up that, I wanted to talk about, again, haven't watched the original 1985 version, but Ariel, given how you've kind of praised the series so far and talked about how they've adapted the property and given like new breath to like the mythology of it, the lore of it, do you prefer the original one to this one, or is there a strength in the original one that you don't see here?
I mean, I like this one, I'll be honest, and I might be betraying my generation here, but I like this one a little bit better. And the reason why is because they go deeper, which you had started to talk about, into the mythology, into the origins.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I wanted to say that, again, not seeing the original, but I find it so interesting that the original creator is Ted Wolf. And the reason why I think they deserved, or to say that why the 2011 version works, is by it stands in such a stark contrast to the 1980 version of it because one, the animation and the original one was actually, when I was looking at all the production notes for it, is that it's done actually in production with Rankin Bass, and that's such
Oh,
a
that's why they say Rankin Bass for the bag, the infinite bag.
yes, yeah. So they do
Ah,
pay a little homage to that, but yeah, it's very interesting that the original '80s version is a Rankin Bass production. We know that, as kids of the '90s, but even though they came out before that, as like Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Little Drummer Boy, and then they went into more traditional anime with Silverhawk and Thundercats. And I only mention this now is because of basically where or why that standard of animation exists as it is. Because looking through like the history of production, you see that Rankin Bass has done so much for the anime community that no one really knows about or pays attention to, because originally they were working with Top Craft, which we brought up in our Arietti discussion about Studio Ghibli, because Top Craft basically divided. They broke apart into Studio Ghibli and the studio that produced the original series of Thundercats, which is Pacific Corporations. I think that was it. Pacific Corporations. And then Pacific Corporations became Disney Animation Japan. So that kind of explains why Studio Ghibli has always been in close proximity to Disney, because they kind of have the same roots of animation. And Thundercats kind of falls into that. So I think that's why when, Ariel, you were talking about when people reboot original series, that they want to show love and dedication to the property or to what they love, is that why they went to Studio 4 degrees Celsius, because they knew that they could push the envelope of animation to give it the proper, not send off, but reverence to it. And it's just one of those things that you have to praise. And again, I'm coming back to the studio saying, oh yeah, they did a good job. But yeah, it's just really interesting to see that what is good about the '80s still stands, but I think it also enhances the viewing of 2011 version. So watching them in parallel or as a double feature is necessary. But Sam, you said you couldn't get past the 3 episodes, so maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, it was all because of Snarf, and as Ariel had said, Panthro made a huge impression in that first episode too. I mean, he lifted a bridge with people walking on it while he was still on the bridge, and oh my, that it was so badass. But as I said, like I had just watched that episode after watching the Thundercats, and so in my mind it's just like I know there's a better version of Snarf out there, so I don't want to slough through this one. I mean, had I not known about 2011, I would have tolerated Snarf to keep going, but since I've seen the 2011 version, I decided not to.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's fair. So I think we've praised the series in full. So let's talk about negatives in a little bit. But is there something like you say, oh, I can't recommend the series for this reason, or this is where the series failed the hardest?
Talking about Kitten Cat, because I think like this would lead into a little bit of the discussion that about season 2 that Jay had mentioned. But I think I read somewhere that the original creators had intended to do more with them, and their goal of going to Eldara in season 2. And I appreciated their goals for doing what they did, and I guess like that's like one of the weaknesses of the shows, because we have an episode with Panthro and Chitara basically trying to quote unquote teach Kitten Cat how to be self sufficient, but it's kind of weird because they both admit that they were orphans, but I mean, by virtue of them being orphans and getting to that point to where they're joining the Thundercats crew, they had to have survived on their own up to a point, so they have some survival skill. And it in that episode, Chitara and Panthro don't acknowledge that Kitten Cat had any survival skill at all. Making it seem as though they were just held up in an orphanage somewhere, when it's apparent to everybody that they grew up in the slums. So it's
I mean, and you see that old episode where the parents get killed with the storm and whatever else. But like, yeah, I agree with that.
and I would have to say, I guess, like, and if we have to be nitpicky and make negatives, um, in this day and age of shows being bingeable, as I mentioned earlier, because it reminded me of Voltron. I was thinking that it was another Netflix show, so I was in that mindset of the story is going to keep going and going and going. But when this show came out, it came out on TV, so it has those bumps for the commercial breaks, and it also takes that episodic approach, not necessarily a bad guy of the week, but sort of like that life lesson that Lionel has to learn every week to sort of become the king that he needs to be. It's not like he has a total lapse in memory every episode, but some of the themes become repetitive, and it's sort of like it sort of makes one think question themselves. It's like he just learned this maybe 2 episodes ago. Like, why is he going through this again? Why? Not saying like why is he acting new per se, but it's sort of uh, at least like trying to get that kind of questioning there. Um, but I guess like that's sort of like one thing to go into it. It's like when you go back and you watch the show, even though it looks new, you have to think about the context, yeah, the context in which the show was made, and have to think about the uh like when it aired, and the type of audience that it was geared towards is not necessarily geared towards modern day, where they don't necessarily have to cut out where nowadays they can cut out the fluff and they can just give you straight story, whereas back then you need to have like that repetitive nature, sometimes like that filler story, so that people can get used to Thundercats coming on air and getting a following to come back weekly, not necessarily uh, guaranteed that a person would sit down and watch the entirety of the show within a day or so.
Exactly. So again, it was produced for the express purposes of being shown on Cartoon Network. And like you said, Sam, is that you have to be mindful of when something is in production, they can gear the writing or certain areas of the storytelling to match the audience that they want to go for, or like the scheduling of it to be a broadcast show, because it's not an OVA or something that you can view online. It was geared for television with cartoon commercials, and as well as to cross promote other series. So there's a lot to talk about with the ending. So what I found most interesting about the ending, so we can talk about it exactly in exact terms, but wanted to say first off about why it is a less enjoyable series. So I do think that the ending does cripple the series as a whole. Not cripple, but it does lessen the series and its effectiveness. And it was originally scheduled for 52 episodes, and you definitely feel that at the end of episode 26, because you get a betrayal by the character Pamra, and like she was working for Mamra the whole time. But there's also some other elements, like you said, Sam, like bringing up, or sorry, Ariel said, like, to understate the existence of the Wildcats. I forgot their code name, the twins, but Kit
Wily
and
Kid
Cat.
and Wily Cat.
Yeah,
Yep.
Kit and Cat. But yeah, so like looking at the blueprints, or at least what was released by the art director Dan Harmon, I believe, or Dan. Yeah, Dan
I
Harmon.
don't
But
think it was. What was it? Dan Harmon?
no,
The
not
guy
the
who
Dan
did.
Harmon,
Yeah.
just another.
Oh,
Not the
okay.
Dan Harmon, but the other
I'm
Dan.
like, what? The same guy who did Community did this? No way. This show is too tame for him.
Exactly.
Oh my
But
gosh.
yeah, the art director. And he was basically saying the blueprints for season 2 was going to be the exploration of the other stones that were needed for the Sword of Omens and the Book of Omens, of course. And same thing with the exploring like Kit and Kat as characters, because they're going to in search of Eldara, like the treasure city or whatever, however that is uh, in the lore. And then also what happens to Pumra, like her motivations of being a traitor, and like she of course plays like the vessel to Mamra, but she also gets comeuppance where it was said like she gets turned into an insect creature. I don't know if that's part of the original Thundercats lore, but apparently she gets transmogrified into an insect in season 2. as well as the creation of the Snarfs. So I'm like, okay,
Oh,
this
so
is
there's
gonna.
going to be more than one?
Well, no, like the creation, like why Snarf exists. It's a
You're talking about the background story about how he is this, like, he's not a cat, but he's just like sort of a cat. He's this creature. Yeah,
He
Yeah,
looks
that'd
like
be
a
cool.
cat and a lizard thing. Yeah, they never really explain him.
exactly. So they were going to talk about that in season 2. It kind of feels that mix of the Smurfs and Gargamel, kind of their relationship with the Smurfette kind of thing. And then the last thing I was very interested in is that they were going to, I think I mentioned this earlier, but they were going to mention how the alliance between Mumra and the Lizards was formed. So all that to say, like season 2 was going to be hype, but for why it only got the season 1, why it was canceled, is that it went on extended hiatus in November of 2011. So between episodes 13 and 14, 13 premiered in November, episode 14 premiered in March, which is kind of killer on a toy line because, again, that's what at the time's Netflix business, not Netflix, but Cartoon Network's business model was, is like to have a show and to have it basically produce a effective toy line, which I think you mentioned, Ariel. So they were still kind of carrying that through because in 2011, this was the only new show that Cartoon Network produced. And by the time Christmas rolled around in 2011, no merchandise was really being, or at least below expectation, merchandise was being passed on the show. So that's kind of the explanation to why it was canceled. So my overall question is, do you feel the same, Ariel, that the ending significantly affects your viewing of the first season?
I mean, 100%. And I think you know that when I watched it, this series partly for this on your recommendation, like it's a good show, but also partly for this podcast, I was PO'd. I mean, I can say it right. I was pissed off. I was like, what the hell? There's no more. Like, I can't believe it. And as Sammy was saying, like that whole like that claw with the gemstones being like the Thanos, with the infinity, what do you call it, glove. It's like, and where are all the other stones and this and that? Like, there's just so much unresolved. And in Primera, like the character that I really liked, but then I ended up really hating. And there was that whole exploration of that whole thing. Like, there were people who felt betrayed by the Thundercats, by their failure, by their inability to stand up for their people. There were people like, and that's her resurrection for the wrong reasons. Like, her soul, like in all its hatred, called out and grabbed Mumra's attention, so he resurrected her in the negative way, comparing that to, where Lion was resurrected by Jaga for like being willing to give up his whole life to save the Thundercats, whatever. And it's like there was so much more that could have been explored, like about Pumarin especially, but also just about that whole good versus evil vibe. I mean, the cats had just got all the different animals to unite behind them, right? And that's how they defeated Mumra at that point. I just felt like there was a lot more to it that could have been done, and I felt like sorely let down. Like, oh my gosh, like where's the rest of it? Are you kidding me? I don't know. Maybe we could start one of those fan-based revolutions. It's a bit late now, but you never know, right?
Petition started.
Yeah, right. And we'll bring back Firefly too.
Yes.
No.
Yeah, so like right now on Cartoon Network, there's a show called Thundercats Roar, and that's kind of the Titan Go version of Teen Titans, or Teen Titans Go is the version of Thundercats Roar to the original Thundercats. So
no, don't even talk about that. Teen Titans Go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you've been overexposed to that, Dad. But
I have, because my kids love it for all the wrong reasons, and I was like, why don't they just show the original Teen Titans? Like, oh gosh.
I make it a point to boycott Thundercats Roar because of its nature, and I know that even before I finished watching this remake of the Thundercats show, like I know that, like, because of like the quality that it has, like I know that the story was going to be good, and to have something like Roar come right after it, it's just going to put a bad taste in people's mouth. It's like, oh, the Thundercats were always silly to begin with.
Right, yeah, because like again, that's one of the parts of adaptation series. It's like what adaptation series do you actually see first, or which series did they first do new generations get exposed to? Because that's always been my problem with the Star Wars, not to loop that back around into the conversation, but I think the detriment of episode 3 is that, spoiler alerts, Anakin Skywalker is Darth Vader is kind of the downfall of that series, because if you watch them in order, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, then that, or if you watch them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then that reveal in 5 that Anakin is Luke's father, then it's not as impactful. So it's kind of in the same vein as like, what series do you let people, or what series do you show people first to feel like this is the base version essentially of it? Because like you can watch the 2011 version and then go back to the 2000 or the 1985 version. But Sam, how do you feel about the ending? Did it ruin the series as a whole for you? Like, did it like cripple your feels for it?
I'm sort of in the same camp as Ariel. It definitely gave me the case of blue balls, but it sort of works because we get to see Lion-O unite all of the animals that are there, and the thing is, like, they were all brought because of Kit and Kat. So just showing how important those characters are, while Lion-O and his crew are doing something else. Even though Kit and Kat are the kids and they were told to be safe, they're like, hey, while everybody else is doing something, we can do something for the group too. Just showing.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, just
really good point.
showing that they're using their agency, right? So just showing like the how they they definitely believed in the characters to hold off to make time for them to go and get reinforcements, right? And just showing how everybody trusts and believe in one another. So like even that at the end, it's a good feeling, but as Ariel had mentioned earlier, there's so many new threads that are left unresolved, and it's obvious that the journey is not going to end. That they have to go and get that final stone before Mumra gets it, and there's going to be a final confrontation for all the stones. So it's really bittersweet. You can leave it like that, but anybody who's worth their salt would want to see all of that resolved. So technically yes, but emotionally no.
Okay, that's very fair to say. So, as always, with the end of our discussion on our 10-year anime review, we always ask the question of resurrect or rebury. So, Ariel, on the decision between to resurrect it, meaning that you would recommend this highly to someone to check out, to say like, oh, this is a good series, you should definitely check it out. Gets Ariel gold star of approval, versus reburied, meaning that it should never be seen by anyone else's eyes, and you were not recommended, essentially. So would you resurrect 2011 Thundercats or rebury it?
I would resurrect. I mean, and even for someone who's never seen the original, I'll just say, watch it. And if they walk out of it at the end, like me, pissed off that it's not continuing or it's unresolved, hey, that means they loved it, wanting to see more, right? Exactly. I would definitely recommend it. It does get my gold star, and for a lot of reasons that I mentioned here. And I didn't mention, because just to throw that in there, that whole sword fighting episode, like the Master of Swords, I love that, and that very much reminded me of those old like Yojimbo, Zatoichi sort of like films. Like I'm a samurai fan, right? Even just for that, like that by itself was an awesome episode. But yeah, totally, I had to throw it in there before the end of the podcast. But I would definitely recommend it.
So many good references. Oh, one more reference before we go. I want to say the Godzilla and Mothra reference. They had that in there, and I was just like, "Oh my goodness, they did that! I can't believe they made it work."
Yeah, so like those are the bits of the Japanese storytelling that I was like keened into, because like that's the way to do it. Like basically Easter eggs, essentially, is that like if you're showing it to an older audience, which again, like maybe that Cartoon Network wasn't really being mindful of, is that a more educated audience is going to see like, oh, that's making a reference to that, that's making a reference to that, and that's what really makes Thundercats more enjoyable, is that you can appreciate the multifaceted characters, you can appreciate the darker tones. It's not the cheesy Saturday morning cartoons that are teaching you a moral lesson every single step of the way. It's that people are dying, even though it's PG-13. There's a lot of death in the show, and there's a lot of adult themes, and they don't go too graphic with it, but they do make you feel that it is not sinister in nature, but it makes you feel like, oh yes, this is a desperate situation. These are people on the run. These are people that, same way as, I guess, keying into the whole Battlestar Galactica feel, is that yes, they are the surviving members of the last people, and then but there is hope at the end of the road. Like, there is a new home to find. There is like a way to defeat the great evil. So Sam, you say resurrect. Ariel, you say resurrect. I'm going to give it a resurrect.
Okay. I was about to say, you're not going to be contrarian. No.
I wanted to hear the reasons why. Go.
No, it's just like, I'm so keen to endings, and an ending can save a really bad series. Also, an ending can ruin a very good series. So I'm kind of on the fence, but given that there's not many other 80 properties that have been really readapted to modern times, like we said, Voltron, the Legendary Defender, and She-Ra, Princesses of Power.
No, it's She-Ra, the Princess of Power.
Oh, the Power. Okay. I thought there were multiple princesses in that show, but
no, I think it's just the one.
Okay,
and then,
so
the Turtles, they're still doing a thing. They got a new show from Nickelodeon. I'm trying to think of some of the other shows that you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, just series that have wide enough appeal as not just like, oh, these are 4 Saturday morning cartoons for kids below the age of 12, but these series that can transcend multiple age demographics, that this feels at home with that. So the ending is bad, but it is saved by everything else that we mentioned during the episode, that I say yes, resurrect.
Yeah, see,
Right.
and Toonami's back, right? So they can always just throw it back on Toonami.
They already did that. That was actually that was actually one of the premiere seasons when Toonami came back in 2012, and that's what I was really saying earlier, is that if they literally waited a year, I think Thundercats would have been like the success that they wanted. But because this was the year prior to Toonami and Adult Swim kind of coming back, resurfacing, then it wasn't really a good match for the demographic they were going for. Because, like, what else premiered in 2011 for Cartoon Network was Looney Tunes, the Looney Tunes show. Batman, the Bold and the Brave ended. And there was some other, this was like the hype of like the renaissance of Cartoon Network. So it's like, it was just a mismatched property for the times, and everyone has forgotten about it for that reason. So that brings an end to our 10-year discussion on Thundercats 2011. Our special guest host, Mr. Ariel Wyckoff. Is there anything you would like to say, Ariel, before we head off?
Just thanks for having me on the show and giving me a platform for expressing my views on all this. So I really appreciate it. Thanks. This is great.
Of course, I'm glad I got a good recommendation, gave a good recommendation. Yeah, so, like, you've been reading a lot, actually. You've been reading a lot, you've been watching a lot. Is there anything that you would like to, as a maybe space fan, as a spacefaring fan, is there anything that you're reading right now or watching right now that you would like to recommend?
I mean, so for me, I just finished up the first 6 from the Dune series. So, and I haven't seen the original Dune movie, like with Kyle MacLachlan and Patrick Stewart from way back in like 84, 85. I'd say keep your eyes open for the new Dune movie. They keep pushing back the launch date. It's supposed to be August. I think it's coming in October, but keep your eyes open for Dune. It's going to rock. That's my sort of impression based on the trailers I've seen.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and it's funny. Like, I didn't know anything about Dune before. Is it called the Lullaby of Madness? Like, so like everything going on with COVID, they like tell you how to wash your hand. Is it the Lullaby of Madness or old? It's the one that's like the Fear is the Mind Killer.
Fear is the Mind Killer. Yeah, that's Dune, right? Yeah. By the way, I think they reference Dune. That's a whole other conversation. They reference Dune all over the Star Wars world. I've seen references in Star Trek, and you talk about Love, Death, and Robots. There's an episode that could be on like Arrakis. But anyway.
Okay, good. All right, awesome. All right, cool. So thank you, Ariel, for coming on. So, Sam, we are finished up with the podcast. What would you like to say before
What? We're finished? Whiskers, I wanted Ariel to tell us what a samoflange was.
Samoflange? A what?